Charles Tunnicliffe was born in 1901 in the village of Langley, just outside the town of Macclesfield, in northwest England. He was the fourth child of William Tunnicliffe and his wife Margaret, and when Charles was still a baby, the family took up the tenancy of the nearby Sutton Lane Ends farm. As he grew up, he became very familiar with the surrounding countryside and wildlife that inhabited the area, and he drew the world around him quite avidly. In 1916, at the age of 15, he started to study at Macclesfield School of Art, and he was subsequently awarded a scholarship to the highly selective Royal College of Art in London. And it was while he studied there that he became particularly adept with etching and engraving techniques. He stayed in London following his graduation in 1923 and taught part-time at Woolwich Polytechnic in London in order to make some form of regular income while attempting to get his career as an artist off the ground. Around the middle of the decade, he started to have increased success with his etchings of rural scenes. Most of these were sold through a contract he had entered into with a publisher of art prints, which had been facilitated by the well-connected writer and art critic Malcolm Salomon. In 1925, Tunnicliffe's father died and his mother sold the farm soon after, but for now he opted to remain in London and continued to make limited edition prints, most of which continued to be etched. But he also worked with other graphic techniques such as wood engraving and scraperboard. He also painted, most frequently in watercolour, but however he created them, his images were invariably depictions of the countryside and farming activities. In 1928 he left the capital and returned to Macclesfield, and following his marriage to Winifred Wonnacott, a fellow art student from the RCA, the couple set up home in the town. From there he continued to create prints and paintings which remained steadfastly rural, so he must have made regular trips to locations more suited to the themes of his work, if only for sketching and making studies for images such as this etching of Macclesfield Forest, among many others. It was as an artist that he continued to make a living into the following decade, but it was in 1932 that he first came to prominence as an illustrator, when he was commissioned to create a collection of 24 dark evocative wood-engraved full-page images to illustrate an edition of Henry Williamson's novel Tarka the Otter. The book had originally been published just 5 years before without any pictorial content, and this edition enjoyed considerably more popular success, undoubtedly due to the quality of Tunnicliffe's absorbing visual depictions. The images were uniformly unsentimental and devoid of anthropomorphic techniques, which enhanced the plausibility of Williamson's narrative considerably. I was fortunate enough to find this image of an original woodblock and the ultimately reversed printed version, which should give a clear indication of how much skill is required with this demanding technique. Following this publication, Williamson was keen to have Tunnicliffe illustrate more of his work, and other collaborations followed in rapid succession. The Lone Swallows, a collection of essays about Williamson's own rural childhood, had originally been published a decade earlier. But Tunnicliffe's evocative woodcuts again brought these reminiscences to life for the reader. There were other books also published in this year for which I could find no usable examples, but Williamson's fantasy novel Starborn, a strange amalgamation of animal and spiritual themes from the same year, did yield at least a couple of engravings of the usual expressive and visually pleasing quality. 1934's Tales from Ebony by Harcourt Williams was a far from typical commission, essentially a collection of rewritten versions of traditional fairy tales from Grimm's and Anderson, and Tunnicliffe's images were all created as full-colour painted pictures for each of the stories. But although this type of fantasy for children was not his usual fare, they were a very credible and engrossing collection. Nevertheless, this would be the only such project he would be involved in. It was also in that year that he collaborated with Williamson yet again for the Peregrine Saga and Other Wild Tales, with the production of more wildlife-themed wood engravings to illuminate the various narratives. Williamson's Salar the Salmon was published in 1936, and it featured some fairly rare examples of colour-painted illustration from Tunnicliffe, all of which undoubtedly gave it far wider commercial appeal. But by this point the relationship between the writer and artist had deteriorated, reportedly due to Williamson becoming increasingly difficult and uncompromising. But whatever the specific reasons for this rift were, they could not be reconciled and never worked together again. In 1937 he turned to wildlife non-fiction with his illustrations for A Book of Birds, written by Mary Priestley. And he created more than 80 wood engravings which were reproduced at various sizes throughout, although for reasons I can't imagine, examples were surprisingly hard to find. Despite his growing success in book illustration, he occasionally ventured into other areas of expression, and among other more commercial projects, he was commissioned to produce a series of engaging images for a press ad campaign for Bob Martin dog care products. And equally infrequently he appeared in a few popular British magazines such as The Bystander, with not a solitary animal or bird in sight. Otherwise he continued to make rurally themed images for prints, and by this point he had gravitated almost exclusively to the use of wood engraving, with strikingly solid results. And although they were never a particularly common aspect of his output, he also occasionally created equally engaging watercolours of the countryside he knew so well. The Second World War began in 1939, but Tunnicliffe had no involvement, and briefly he taught art at Manchester Grammar School. Whether this was to boost his income while the country was more occupied with saving Europe from Hitler and Mussolini, I couldn't say. But in 1942 he published My Country Book, for which he also wrote the text, and that project must have occupied him for the previous year or two. It gathered together all the various strands of his abiding interest in wildlife, farming and country life in general. It was also a significantly diverse collection of images, with predominantly monochrome sketches and animal studies, but also some of his wood-engraved scenes and depictions of animals, and perhaps most significantly, a healthy sprinkling of colour work. Most of these images weren't painted as such, but executed in what looks very much like either coloured pencil or pastels, or possibly both, which was an aspect of his enviable armoury of skills not often seen. And although he approached his fairly wide-ranging subject matter from any number of angles, it was inevitable that it would be bird life which ultimately dominated the visual content of the book. The same year also saw the publication of Going Fishing, written by the improbably named Negley Farson. And despite the rather prosaic title, the book was actually an autobiographical account of the writer's travels all over the world in pursuit of his obsession with angling. And consequently the illustrations Tunnicliffe created reflected this, with a collection of primarily scenic evocations of places he had never personally seen. And evidently not hampered by the ongoing global conflict, he also illustrated In the Heart of the Country, a eulogy to the British countryside written by the novelist H.E. Bates. Once more the images were created as wood engravings, and although rurally themed, some at least contain references to the ongoing state of war and its looming threat to the nation. In 1946 The Happy Countryman by C. Henry Warren was published, which featured small but telling black and white chapter headings to set the scene for the reader. A year later, Tunnicliffe and his wife left Macclesfield for Maltraeth on the island of Anglesey, just off the coast of North Wales. In 1947 he was co-credited along with the respected writer Sidney Rogerson on the cover of Our Bird book, featuring a large number of breathtaking colour paintings of bird life, and it met with considerable popular success. Given the quality and authenticity of Rogerson's written portraits of the various species on display, and of course Tunnicliffe's paintings and their invariably attractive aesthetic qualities, this was hardly surprising. The images were of a quality not often seen, and their frequent placing on white backgrounds with minimal supporting vegetation hark back to the hand-painted engravings of the Victorian masters of ornithological art. Many of his studies were made from close examination of dead creatures, but like a taxidermist he brought them to plausible life for the viewer. 2 years later, in 1949, another Rogerson book, Both Sides of the Road, was also published. This work was an overview of farming life in Britain, and in particular the older methods that had predated the growing trend to more industrialised methods taking place. Tunnicliffe's images were another dazzling and authentic collection of paintings which faithfully recorded the subject with images of the places, people and animals without undue sentimentality. Nevertheless, it was both a celebration and lamentation of the imminent passing of a simpler and more natural way of life. Despite his obvious overwhelming interest in birds, he also created quite a few pleasing images of cats, and in particular what I can only assume was his own Siamese. When these examples were created, or whether they were used as illustration or simply produced to sell as art for hanging, I have no idea, but I would not have been happy to leave them out because of that. In 1953 he was one of two illustrators, the other being fellow wildlife artist Raymond Shepherd, who were commissioned to illustrate Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. Why the publisher didn't just choose one of them, particularly as their monochrome styles were quite close to each other, I have no idea. But the illustrated edition fared well in commercial terms, undoubtedly due to the addition of visual embellishments from both. In the middle of the 1950s, his work appeared numerous times on the covers of the RSPB's seasonal bulletin Bird Notes. And in the later years of the decade and into the 60s, Tunnicliffe's painted work was also used to illustrate Brook Bond tea cards, which were avidly collected by British children, including me and even some adults. For younger viewers and those from other countries, this blameless activity probably needs some explanation. The cards were contained in packs of tea, and they featured images of various types of animal, mostly British, but there were others from more exotic locations too. And when you'd eventually collected the complete set, you could paste them into an album. Looking back, it seems a rather odd thing to do, but I can remember being a keen participant at the age of 8 or 9, and that's when I first encountered the name and work of Charles Tunnicliffe. It was also at this time that he illustrated a number of books for Ladybird, a well-known children's publisher of the period. Among others, he illustrated a particularly evocative collection, each of which featured images related to the seasons of the year, with images of wildlife in their natural habitats and relevant farming activities. And just like the tea cards, I can remember visually devouring these images and marvelling at the precision and visually engrossing qualities of his work. Being born and raised in the city, these specific illustrations seemed to me to depict a magical and colourful world that I only saw on occasion. And even then, the reality of rural England, however charming, somehow didn't quite match up to Tunnicliffe's evocations. In 1966 he created this cover image for the Radio Times, and although I can't find a precise year for these small spot scraperboard illustrations from the magazine, I'll venture a guess they were published around the same time. Tunnicliffe's status as one of Britain's best known and most respected wildlife artists was now self-evident, and by this point his prints and originals were fetching high prices from collectors. But in the later 1960s he began to suffer from failing eyesight, and in 1969 his wife died. Following this loss he had a heart attack, and he was subsequently diagnosed as diabetic. Nevertheless, he did manage to carry on working, even if at a much reduced volume, and these particularly impressive paintings of big cats were dated 1972. And he continued to be associated with the RSPB, with covers for their magazine simply titled Birds, which had replaced the earlier Bird Note. And in 1978 the RSPB Big Book of Garden Birds, written by Linda Bennett, was published, with 36 meticulously observed and rendered colour images. I don't know for sure, but I'm fairly certain these were gathered from earlier work and reprinted for the book. But even if so, it was a fitting epitaph to his life and work, as he died in 1979 at the age of 78. By all accounts, Charles Tunnicliffe was essentially a very private man who simply wanted to be left alone to create his pictures and write about his passion for the natural world. He never ventured beyond the British Isles, and any commissions involving foreign subject matter was informed by zoological trips, museum exhibits and books. Since his death, his illustrations have continued to be reprinted numerous times, and quite a bit of his output has also been repurposed for greetings cards and calendars and other forms of merchandising. Following his death, much of his work was bequeathed to Anglesey Council, and it can now be seen at the Anglesey Gallery, the name of which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce in Welsh. There is a fairly comprehensive website with his work at the Charles Tunnicliffe Society.co.uk, although it wasn't much use to me for this video as the images were generally nothing like good enough resolution. But it's still well worth a view, and here are just a few more favourites from the many images I gathered to see us out.